There's been a whole lot of shaking going on in Wichita, and we've got to look at what's up with that. Plus, a push to prevent social media companies from banning conservative speech. But first, the governor signs a new bill into law limiting her emergency powers, and counties say it's tying their hands too in the face of the pandemic. That's what we're talking about right now on Kansas Week. I'm Pilar Pedraza, and this is Kansas Week. And what a week it's been, again. We're kicking things off this week with a look at the new Kansas law that once again changes what the governor can and can't do in a state emergency. We hear first from KAKE's Morgan Mobley on how these changes are directly impacting local decisions.
Thought that it was a little too soon.
I think it's about time. I think Sedgwick County's about ready.
Split opinions.
Commissioner Lopez?
No.
Commissioner Dennis?
Aye.
Commissioner Howell?
Aye.
Commissioner Cruz?
No.
Chairman Meitzner?
Aye.
And split votes, but the decision is final. The Sedgwick County Commission voted 3-2 Wednesday morning in favor of ending the current public health order, including the mask mandate. The move comes ahead of a bill sitting on Governor Laura Kelly's desk that would void all local health orders statewide. She's expected to sign the bill any day.
I just don't think it's a good way to govern, to say potentially this could happen.
Commissioner Sarah Lopez says this action was taken too soon, calling it disrespectful.
So I'm sorry to everybody that works in the medical community, because this was the wrong decision in my viewpoint.
Commissioner Jim Howell says it's time people are responsible for themselves and their own decisions.
In light of the fact that our dashboard has improved data right now, I think it's time for us to move forward and trust our citizens.
Commissioners say a big reason for Wednesday's decision is the number of potential lawsuits the county could face. It would be forced to set up a hearing within 72 hours of being filed.
The reality is, I think we're going to see huge amounts of lawsuits we are unlikely to win. We have to defend with tax dollars.
Masks and social distancing now not required, but county leaders are still recommending them.
I don't like wearing the mask, but I feel at the same time that it not only protects me, but it protects everybody else. And so if we can keep it going until we know that the COVID virus has been stamped out.
And we're hearing some schools also getting similar lawsuit threats if they don't drop mask requirements. Meanwhile, the governor has now signed that bill, SB 40, into law. Joining me today to take a look at what all of this means, we have here on set Dr. Neil Allen, a political scientist from Wichita State University, and by Zoom, Dr. Michael Smith, a political scientist from Emporia State University. And there's a lot of confusion here about what all is going on and what this means, but one thing that we do have to keep in mind is while counties may be backing off of these mask mandates because of this change, the governor has reissued the statewide mask mandate, so masks still kind of a thing in a lot of places here.
That's right. The state and local authority kind of overlaps, and of course there's another huge issue here, which is the whole issue of enforcement. What exactly do they plan to do if people aren't wearing masks? A lot of the enforcement actually takes place with regards to establishments rather than individuals. And a lot of that falls to local. So even if there's a statewide ordinance, if the local government isn't interested in enforcing it, it's probably not going to be enforced.
Another aspect of that is I've heard from a lot of local commissioners, not just Sedgwick County, others as well. They don't want to say it in public, but they're frustrated because they feel like their hands have been tied by this bill.
Well, and I think that's right, that that clearly we have a situation where the state government is attempting to affect the decisions of local government, and especially here with the threat of legal action. And also a big loser, or big losers in all this, are businesses that want to keep mask mandates and social distancing enforced in their establishments, because with a governmental order, then they have backup. I mean, if you go to lots and lots of places, you know, here in Wichita, and I'm sure all across the state, you will see signs saying, please wear masks, governor's order. And there's a good chance that the people running that business want to keep having masks and social distancing to keep themselves safe and their customers safe, and also to get their customers to go into places. Yeah. But without the backup of the government, then that's going to be a lot harder for them. And we're sadly probably going to see disturbances and conflict within not just public government spaces, but public spaces that are run by private entities. And also, there just is no medical reason to say that the coronavirus and COVID threat is over, and that now we can rely on individuals to keep us all safe.
Yeah, and certainly there are laws, even if there's not a law that says you have to wear a mask in public. We saw this in Texas, Michael, where they dropped the statewide mask mandate, but businesses kept their orders in place, and when people were violating them, they were arrested on trespassing.
That's right. I mean, the businesses can still set regulations. So it's just really, really complicated right now. We're in this in-between state. Some of us have gotten vaccinated, some haven't, some are awaiting a second dose. But there's a lot of concern about premature reopening, and there's also a lot of fatigue with the restrictions.
And this has also become extremely politicized, Michael. Is there any sort of middle ground on this?
Boy, you wish. Is there middle ground about anything in politics today? There probably is behind the scenes on a few things, but anything that becomes divisive, in my opinion, mask mandates should be the least controversial. I think some really strong arguments will be made when we do the post-mortem on this about whether we should have closed schools. The social costs of that have been immense. But the irony is that so often we latch on to mask mandates, and those have a very, very low social cost. They're just basically uncomfortable, and that's it. That's something that shouldn't be controversial. And by the way, neither should getting vaccinated be.
No. And speaking of getting vaccinated here in Sedgwick County, they've opened it up to phase 5. Lots of folks taking advantage right away to get in and get those shots.
I mean, that's right, and I think this is, frankly, probably should have happened a few days ago, considering the way that the rollout has gone. And but on these ideas about public health measures, we should think about the upside risk and the downside risk. And so the upside of vaccinations is massive, and the upside of doing things like masks and social distancing is also massive. The downside is relatively small, because the difference of my daily life between this and this is very small. But the difference between me here being able to work and instead being home with COVID-19 is massive. And but this is just another case in Kansas where the governor and the legislature are at opposite views on things. And frankly, the governor's race of the fall of 2022 is getting in the way of a lot of public health work.
Yeah, and certainly has been a big part of many of these debates we've been seeing. Was not, however, the only debate in Topeka this week. Kansas senators discussing another bill that would also limit both the governor's and the Secretary of State's rule powers in their control over state elections. Rebecca Chong of the KSN Capitol Bureau explains.
The bill would prevent the governor from changing election laws. Republicans doing whatever they can to limit her power. Democrats saying it's unnecessary. It was a tumultuous presidential election across the country.
Our very identity as Americans is at stake.
The highest number of mail-in ballots, officials everywhere revamping rules and deciding what late ballots would count. Kansas never had problems, and Republican lawmakers want to make sure the chaos stays away.
Most of the concern is not from what happened in Kansas, but maybe what happened elsewhere, and we're trying to prohibit that.
In Kansas, mail-in ballots must be postmarked by Election Day and received by the county election office up to 3 days after the election to be counted. Senators are hearing on a bill that would prevent the governor or Secretary of State from changing the law. Supporters say it's a necessary step in making elections safer for Kansans. But other lawmakers see it as another attempt to place limits on the governor.
I've served under 5 governors, and I never heard of a governor doing anything of this nature.
State senators held their first hearing on the measure today. If it passes out of committee, it will move to the Senate floor for debate. At the Capitol, I'm Rebecca Chung.
A lot of these things that were happening in other states, we heard about Wisconsin, the governor putting in controls, going to the Supreme Court, stuff like that. Not too often that we see state laws about state actions being based on things that happen in other states.
Well, maybe not that we can tell, but there's a lot of behind-the-scenes work about communication between different states, both because of the fact that politicians interact with each other as conferences and as part of political party groups. But also there are lots of groups that attempt to influence legislation across the country. One called ALEC does a lot of work on conservative causes. But in this case, we have had so much attention on elections because of the presidential election of 2020 that you're going to see ideas moving from state to state. But I just wonder whether this is a solution in search of a problem. And also, when we talk about governor and secretary of state setting regulations, we're really talking about emergency measures. And also, if you think about it, if we have some kind of pandemic level catastrophe next year, our legislature will be done in May on their normal schedule. They don't like coming back into special sessions. Special sessions are difficult, especially if you have a massive agenda like the pandemic would cause. And if you put elections in the middle of that, I don't think that's a recipe for good government. And there is a reason why we have a Secretary of State with Chief Election Authority, because things like mail balloting and access might need to be adjusted in cases of emergency. And right now, the legislature is considering making themselves the people dealing with election emergencies. And I'm not sure that 40 state senators and 125 state House members are necessarily the people that can handle that work.
Yeah. Well, and certainly that limited legislative session, something that could be a big concern when dealing with that, because Kansas has a citizen legislature, Michael, as opposed to other states that have a full-time legislature that's there every day of the year or every week of the year at least.
A few states have that, like California. Many states have what we call the hybrid, where they're in office longer than Kansas and they make considerably more money than Kansas's pay and the small per diem. Not quite full-time, it's not quite like Congress, but there's no question about it. And the staffing too. I mean, a lot of House members only have, one staff member for every 3 House members for personal staff. So Kansas legislators are stretched quite thin, and to pass legislation which the premise of this is there's not a problem in Kansas. It's a little dodgy when there are other things that need to be addressed.
And talking about other things that need to be addressed, it's one of several bills that have been raised this session about changing elections up. The only one that I've heard of that's really made much progress is one that would require third parties that send out absentee ballot applications to more clearly identify who they are and what they're doing, because there was a lot of confusion about that during this last election.
I mean, that's correct, and we've talked about that on this show in the past. And also there in other states has been action on the question of who can actually can deliver an absentee ballot, and also, but there's partisanship behind this too, because in general, Democratic aligned groups tend to do more work with Get Out to Vote, and also are more likely to be groups that are existing and work just for the election. But in Kansas, we should remember that we have very well functioning elections, that we've had some really tight elections like the governor's primary for the Republicans in 2018, but no real allegations or evidence of any kind of problems. Yeah. And so we should be happy frankly, with how things have been going.
Yeah. Well, and we're going to have to leave that discussion there. It's going to be interesting to see if any of these bills make it forward, because they are running out of time in the legislature. Another thing that they were talking about this week in Topeka, stopping social media companies from silencing conservative voices. It was at the center of another bill that was under debate. KSN's Alec Gartner shows us how Republican lawmakers hope to do all that.
Many conservatives believe their First Amendment rights are being restricted by companies like Facebook and Twitter. So a senator says he has a plan to give people their voice back. After the 2020 election and the controversies that followed, Hutchinson Senator Mark Steffen decided to sponsor a bill to address what social media allows. The proposal specifically states that harassing or objectionable speech, currently able to be removed by websites, cannot include political information or expression.
I think black and white lies would probably qualify as objectionable. The problem is when you get into politics, it doesn't take much before it becomes gray.
Steffen says the bill doesn't favor conservatives or liberals, but protects anyone from being marginalized on social media sites. Multiple internet advocates spoke against the bill, one suggesting looking to other options.
My answer is to trust competition. Join social media platforms that are friendlier
to posts that you might want to make about the election, about COVID lockdowns, and about cancel culture.
But supporters of the bill say new social media sites like Parler are nice, but switching platforms shouldn't be necessary.
While we can move to sites that are more comfortable, and we should, that's not the solution.
The bill would need to be passed out of the Senate Federal and State Affairs Committee before it could head to the floor for a full vote. Reporting at the Capitol, I'm Alec Gartner.
Hey, Michael, I'm going to start with you on this one. This is another issue that's gotten a lot of talk at the national level. Now we're seeing it here locally in Kansas. I have to wonder, though, if to protect one person's First Amendment rights, are lawmakers in danger of stepping on companies' First Amendment rights?
This whole thing is a mess. First of all, Facebook, Twitter, and the rest are private companies or owned by private companies, but they're also public fora. The other problem is they are international, and for individual states to start regulating them is going to be an absolute mess. Is who gets prosecuted? If the person posting lives in the state, if someone who can read it lives in the state, or if it just theoretically could be viewed in that state. And we're going to have 50 different states and the District of Columbia passing 51 different sets of regulations. I just don't think this is workable at all.
And Neil, your thoughts, does this bill have a chance of going anywhere?
I mean, I would think it's unlikely, and for some of the reasons that Michael talked about. Also, I think at some point we're going to have to wrestle with the idea that these are private companies, and we in general believe that private companies, media companies or otherwise, have the ability and the right to make their own decisions. Now, if we want to start regulating social media companies like utilities, we can do that. But also then we have to start deciding, as citizens through our legislators, what speech is allowed and isn't allowed. And also, but this idea about that there's a place to go if you don't want to go on Facebook, that there's a problem with that argument because, politicians and citizens that want to affect public policy, they want to be where everybody else is. And as we can see with the Parler model, that totally collapsed. One, because it didn't have the reach, and also it turns out that Parler was dependent upon Amazon to run their data and servers. And when Amazon shut them down, then Parler in effect is shut down. So it's a real problem. Although in general, maybe the market mechanism is a way to deal with this. If you don't like what Facebook is doing to people whose views you agree with, then stop using Facebook and stop giving them your eyeballs, which makes them billions and billions of dollars.
Yeah. And it's an interesting debate. We're going to have to see where that one goes, as with so many things that come up in Topeka. Well, lawmakers got a better idea of what's been causing all the shaking we felt in East Wichita over the last few months, but still no final answers for those living in the earthquake zone this week.
The house shakes for about 3 or 4 seconds, and then we go try to find if there's any cracks in the walls.
Trey Oliver has been through so many earthquakes since last Thanksgiving, he's developed a routine response, something he never expected to do in Kansas.
This is normally things that you hear about and deal with in California.
At first, Kansas geologists thought the quakes were natural, saying we were overdue in this area.
In 1919, there was one event in 1948 that were magnitude 3s.
But then came earthquakes with magnitudes of 3.7, 3.9.
All of a sudden, it starts looking a little bit funny.
Dr. Rick Miller of the Kansas Geological Survey told state lawmakers Thursday they now believe human action is behind the tremors, that these quakes have been building up for a long time as wastewater injection wells have pumped more and more water into a shelf of rock thousands of feet below the surface, increasing the pressure on the giant slabs of earth resting against each other along fault lines under the city.
Somewhere around 2003, we start to see a gradual increase, and somewhere in 2011, the rate of increase in pressure increased quite a bit.
That higher pressure meaning it now takes less to cause the ground to shift. But what's actually sparking each individual shift here in Wichita, they just don't know yet.
Wichita cluster, we don't have any smoking gun. There's nothing here that really says dramatically that if it was induced, what caused it.
Something both the scientists at KGS and Wichitans like Trey would like to know.
I'd be interested to see more of the science come out on that.
And while lawmakers can't exactly control natural phenomena like earthquakes, if they can figure out what the human trigger is in each individual case, there might be some regulations that come out of it.
That's right, and I mean, and as a resident of East Wichita, you know, I would rather not have my house shaking every once in a while. And one time, I think it was like 5 times on a Sunday, and also a couple of these have gotten close to the level where you could see serious property damage, close to past the point, the 4.0 level, and you know, it seems like there's growing scientific consensus that earthquakes like this and earthquakes in other places are related to hydraulic fracturing for oil and gas, not because of the actual drilling for the oil and gas, but the fact that in order to do fracking, you got to shoot a whole bunch of water with a bunch of chemical compounds in it into the ground to loosen up the deposits, and then that water is so incredibly nasty and dangerous that you can't leave it in a lake, you can't put it anywhere, you basically got to shove it back into the ground. And if you do enough of that, you can increase the pressure, and then you have earthquakes. And we're getting in Wichita a little bit of what our friends down in Oklahoma have talked about. I've got plenty of students coming from Oklahoma talk about how, you know, every day is like an earthquake day. And there is a way to deal with this. One, we can put regulations on the amount of water that people get to shove into the ground in injection wells. And also, we could maybe let the market help to decide this by finding a way to actually put taxes so that actually we are paying for all of the costs of our energy. Because there's natural gas that comes into my house so that we can heat our house. And if part of the cost of that is going to be earthquakes, then the cost of that ought to rise to the point where maybe other ways to get energy are better because they're safer. Because electric heating done with solar or wind doesn't cause the ground to shake and stuff to fall off the wall.
Yeah. Michael, what do you think about that? A tax on oil and gas to help cover the earthquake risks?
The classic economist's idea, don't ban things, don't regulate them, just tax them based on what are called externalities. You know, the search for natural gas is so complicated because it's a quick and readily available bridge fuel that if it's handled properly does not contribute to global warming. Now, if it leaks, it does. And there's a massive demand for it, for example, to generate electricity in California. However, this is the cost. So it's quite a dilemma.
Yeah, and as we look at that dilemma, of course, lots of people wanting to know, you mentioned the potential for damage. Now, they did make a point. They said that historically, based on what we've seen before and on the geology here, they can't see anything over 4.5. And really, you have to get into the 6s or 7s, they said, for it to be serious damage. But we've had lots of people talk about cracks in walls and stuff just because of the repetitive nature of what we've been seeing.
Yeah, that's right. And you know, in my house, there's a crack that opened up in about the same spot it probably opened up 10 years ago, and it's not necessarily, you know, only about earthquakes. But you know, whenever we know now, we know enough from fracking and the use of hydraulic injection wells that there is a serious situation going on, then it makes sense to take a look at it. And also, we shouldn't assume that energy is free. None of our resources are free. There has to, and even something like water, you know, it has to be work done to get it from where it is into our houses. And it's helpful, I think, if we can have more understanding of this. And also, I think what we've learned in the last few years is that Mother Nature, when interacting with human beings, can behave in ways that we may not necessarily be prepared for. And just because now things are 3 and 4 earthquakes doesn't mean there won't be some complicated stuff in the future. And it makes sense for us to do the science now so that we can preserve our energy infrastructure and the places we live.
Yeah. Well, they are certainly right now trying to figure out, they've asked for more information from the companies that run these various wastewater injection wells, trying to figure out what was happening in those 6 months before these quakes started to see if they can figure out what the actual triggers for each individual tumbler was. So we'll have to find out what that is and see if we can make a difference in there. All right, well, one more thing to talk about today, a white powder, an evacuation and accusations of terroristic threats. That's what happened at the Sedgwick County Courthouse this last week. The sheriff says all because of something called a sovereign states group.
For whatever reason, they have really become very active in about the last 4 to 5 months. Half the time we don't even know who it is. But the letters have gotten more threatening.
Sheriff Jeff Easter says Monday afternoon, those threats became real when a county employee on the 8th floor of the courthouse opened a letter from a group he called the Moorish National Republic. Inside, Easter says, was a white powder that began to cause a reaction.
runny nose, eye irritation, those type of things.
Medics took one person to the hospital as a precaution. Another they treated at the scene. Firefighters temporarily closed the courthouse, even shutting down the ventilation to prevent the powder from spreading to other floors. Investigators later identified it as a chemical used in hair dye. The sheriff says the Moorish National Republic is something called a sovereign states group that doesn't believe the U.S. Constitution applies to it.
They issue out sometimes identity cards and passports, and when they're stopped by the police, they claim diplomatic immunity.
Dr. Greg Etter used to work for the Sedgwick County Sheriff's Office. Now he teaches criminal justice at the University of Central Missouri, where he studies sovereign states groups.
They're an anti-tax, anti-government group.
He says while they generally deal in something called paper terrorism, for example, using court filings to clog up the legal system and target government officials they don't like, they can sometimes become violent.
These groups are persistent, but they're small. Usually they're in groups of 20s, 30s, scattered all over the country.
And Michael, I've heard of militia groups before, but sovereign states groups, that was a new one for me. And I've got to say, my jaw hit the floor when I learned about the fact that they issue their own passports and driver's licenses and license plates.
They do. This group is interesting. They've been around for some time, and this gentleman obviously studies them. I've seen those homemade license plates. That's a real thing. And I've met law enforcement officers and also judges that have worked with these sovereign citizens. One thing that's interesting, I've come to understand, I'm just now learning about this particular group, is that it's African Americans. And typically these groups are made up of whites, especially white males. So that's a little bit different twist on it.
Another issue about this is that there is a similarly named series of temples throughout Kansas, and they wanted us to be very clear that they were not connected to it. Now, some law enforcement agents that I spoke with had their doubts about that lack of connection, but not unusual to have similarly named groups out there with perhaps different aims.
Well, and also a lot of times groups like this are appealing to ideas that we actually might all share. Like, I do believe in individual freedom as well. I believe that there are limits upon that the government has to follow for how they deal with we as citizens. But it is a settled question that if you live here, you have to pay taxes here, you have to follow government regulations. I have a driver's license from Kansas, which is the only kind of driver's license as a citizen of Wichita that I'm able to get, which is how it ought to be, because I'm pretty sure this group is not set up to handle the infrastructure of making sure people are competent drivers. But this is part of living in a democracy. But really, we need to enable the law enforcement and also nonprofit groups to do the necessary work to figure out who these groups are, so when they have an attack, we're ready.
Well, thank you, Neil, and thank you, Michael, so much for joining me. We have run out of time. We'd love to continue the conversation with you online. Just look for Pilar Pedraza TV or PBS Kansas PTV on Facebook, Instagram, or Twitter. Stay safe and have a great week.